Chapter 18. The Flood. The hotel's basement was indeed flooded. For a few moments the children studied the still dark water at the bottom of the stairs.
"I have to warn you, I'm a lousy swimmer."
Scooter shivered at the prospect of immersing himself into this cold, murky mass.
"Oh, stop fretting," Hoggie replied. "It can't be deeper than 1/2 metre."
To show her friend that he had nothing to fear, Hoggie marched to the bottom of the stairs and boldly stepped into the water.
"Ouch!"
"What is it?" Scooter echoed uneasily.
"The water is icy," Hoggie admitted, "but it is only knee-deep. Come on, Scooter, let's go."
The friends waded across the basement, illuminating their way with Scooter's flashlight. Shortly the beam of the light fell upon a massive iron door, covered in dust and cobwebs.
"This must be it,"
Scooter pronounced. The door was locked with a padlock, which Hoggie unlocked with one of her hairpins. With a low rumble, the door opened into a dark and musty underground passage. Hoggie took the padlock with her, lest someone lock them out, and the friends ventured into the dark. Slowly they followed the passage for 200 steps or so, before coming to a crossroads of 3 tunnels. The tunnel to the left was pitch black.
"This one must lead to the canal,"
Hoggie guessed, remembering the city's layout. The other 2 were illuminated by tiny lamps installed into the tunnel's ceiling some 10 metres apart, a sign that the passages were still used from time to time by the local businesses. Hoggie and Scooter continued straight, but after a while bumped into a fairly new concrete wall. They then retraced their steps and followed the right-hand tunnel. It was wider and taller, and, because of this, its darkness seemed even more ominous. And every tiny sound, every gust of air, every water drop, dripping from the ceiling and plummeting into the water below, amplified tenfold, startling the young adventurers.
"I bet the river has flushed all the rats out," it occurred to Scooter. "I don't like rats." "Is this why you've armed yourself?"
Hoggie glanced at the shovel that Scooter found in the basement and brought with him on their tour of London's underground.
"Relax, they are harmless."
But Scooter wouldn't be convinced, and for the next 200 metres he kept eyeing the tunnel's walls suspiciously, and listening for the sounds of tiny feet splashing in the water. Hoggie tried to picture the city above them. They must have passed the bank and the toy store next to it, and were now walking underneath the large grocery store in the direction of the library. Hoggie thought she could feel the tunnel's walls and ceiling vibrate slightly every time a bus drove by on the street above. Now and again, short branches shot right and left off the main tunnel. The children would follow them, recalling the map of the city, and making a note of where these short passages might lead: a jewellery shop, a tea-house, a Greek restaurant. But wherever the short passages led, they all ended with a rusty door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. In the meantime, the water in the tunnel was rising. Already the children were up to their waists in it. At last Scooter declared, "We really should go back, Hoggie. Another hour or 2 and this place will be flooded all the way to the ceiling." Hoggie stretched her neck, trying to see what was hiding in the darkness ahead. Scooter was right. It would be dangerous to stay underground much longer. Still, she hated to give up her search without learning anything at all.
"I'm just going to walk another 100 metres or so," she said in the end. "You stay here."
Scooter would not argue with that. He clung to the tunnel's wall, his teeth chattering uncontrollably from both cold and fear, and watched Hoggie wade deeper into the tunnel. Her tiny figure was illuminated by the ceiling lights, and by the occasional reflection of the flashlight in the water. Suddenly, Scooter noticed something farther in the tunnel. He caught a glimpse of it just as it entered the tiny circle of ceiling light on the water surface. Scooter thought at first that it was a piece of debris, an old box or a ball of newspapers floating in the water. But the next moment he realized that the object was a lot bigger and stranger looking than any old piece of junk. What's more, it was not just floating in the water. It was moving, ever so slowly, towards Hoggie. The tunnel's floor was becoming more and more slippery. Worried about losing her footing and falling face first into the dirty water, Hoggie did not immediately notice the strange object ahead.
"Hoggie!"
Scooter called out to her.
"I really think you should come back." "Just a little farther, Scooter,"
Hoggie replied.
"I think the tunnel is bending ahead. I want to see what's there."
As she pointed towards the end of the tunnel, the beam of the flashlight fell upon the large, log-like object.
"What is that?"
Hoggie made a few steps forward, but then stopped paralysed by a sudden and inexplicable fear.
"I don't know, but I don't like it," Scooter said. "Please come back."
Her eyes and flashlight fixed on the object, Hoggie started moving backwards. Because of the semi-darkness of the tunnel, she could not quite tell how far she was from the object, but she had a feeling that it was following her. Scooter was sure of it. From his place, he could see the object's movement as it sometimes vanished out of sight, and then reappeared again in the next circle of a ceiling light. Scooter could not swear by it, but he thought that he even saw a large tail pop out of the water for a second.
"It's alive!" he screamed. "Run, Hoggie, run!"
Hoggie turned around and hastened up the tunnel as much as the water and the slippery floor underneath her feet would let her. It didn't seem fast enough, and so she plunged into the muddy water and began to swim quicker than she had ever swum in her physical education class. Meanwhile, Scooter began to shriek while beating the wall with the shovel.
"Stay away! Wherever you are, stay away, or I'll chop your tail off!"
A minute later, Hoggie caught up with Scooter. He grabbed her hand, and the two of them ran up the tunnel, and would not stop or even glance back until they reached the hotel's basement and slammed the iron door behind them.
"What in the world was that?"
Hoggie said, taking in huge gulps of air.
I have no idea."
Scooter pressed his ear against the door, and listened for the sounds of pursuit. But whatever their strange encounter was, it must have decided the children weren't worth chasing.
"Was it a fish? It could have been trapped in the tunnels when the river rose."
Scooter considered this.
"Some pikes grow to be pretty big, but fish don't lurk."
He shook his head.
"If it weren't so totally impossible, I'd say it was an alligator." "Well, I've heard stories of alligators living in the sewers of the big cities,"
Hoggie offered.
"Oh, hogwash."
Scooter was too tired and shaken to try being polite.
"It's just another urban myth. No alligator would survive in the sewers. They need food and clean water and fresh air just like everybody else. Besides, how would they get into the sewers in the first place?" "Maybe people get them as pets when they are tiny, and then get rid of them when they get too big."
Scooter rolled his eyes.
"Have you ever seen alligators for sale in a pet store?" "No, that's because it's illegal. You can't keep an alligator as a pet if you live in a city." "Well, if it wasn't an alligator, then what was it?"
"I don't know," Scooter replied, taking out his hanky and wiping the sweat and the dirty water off his face.
"But I don't want to go into another tunnel ever again, for the rest of my life."
Even if Hoggie hadn't taken a dip in the tunnel, she still would have been soaked to the skin. By then the rain was pouring so hard one couldn't see farther than 5 steps ahead, and what used to be mere puddles just the day before had turned into street-wide shallow ponds. Scooter's apartment building was closer to the Luxembourg Hotel, and he invited Hoggie to stay at his place for what was promising to be a stormy night. But Hoggie wanted to be home in case the kidnappers called, and so the friends stopped by Scooter's just long enough to grab some dry clothes and feed General, and then scurried off to St. Clair's Lane.
"What are we going to do now?"
Scooter asked, as he and Hoggie gathered around a teapot.
"It has been nearly 48 hours, but we still don't have the book." "I suppose, next time the kidnappers call, I'll have to explain to them what happened. They may already know."
She pointed at that day's newspaper, which she and Scooter had picked up on their way home. The photograph of the bronze lion, sitting by Saint Jerome's right side, was on the front page.
I'll ask for more time. They'll have to give it to us if they really want us to find the mirror."
Scooter nodded.
"Is there anything we can do tonight? I was going to take another look at Edward Barnaby's letters to see if I'd missed anything." "What about me? What can I do?"
Hoggie looked at the clock. By then it was already 9.
"Why don't you grab some sleep, Scooter?" she suggested. "It's been a long day. Take my bed."
But Scooter was too preoccupied with the fate of Aunt Michelle to fall asleep just then. He tried to get some news, but none of the channels Hoggie's and Aunt Michelle's old TV set usually received were on. He flipped through invariable images of snow several times before finally giving up. He then tried the radio. None of the major stations were on either. But as Scooter was about to give up and go to bed, he tuned into a small AM station that was just finishing its news broadcast.
"And for those of our listeners who are planning a trip, as of 2100 hours today, Heathrow Airport is still closed. Paul, any updates on why the airport is closed?"
The man to whom the radio announcer referred as Paul promptly responded.
"Well, Gerald, the official report issued by the city says that the airport's traffic control centre is experiencing technical difficulties. But from what I've heard from the people who have been waiting for their flight for the last 3 days, there may be a completely different reason for the closure." "And why is that?" "Well," Paul carried on, "airports close because of technical problems all the time, but rarely for longer than a few hours. And during the closure, the passengers are usually allowed to stay at the airport. But what we have here is not just the airport closure, but its complete evacuation." "Evacuation?" "Yes, evacuation," Paul insisted. "All the passengers and the airport employees have been asked to leave. And not only the air traffic is now being directed away from the airport, but all the car traffic as well. Have you seen M4 in the last 24 hours? It's madness. My sources tell me that over 300 police officers are cordoning the airport at the moment. And there is more. Apparently the Air Force are also involved. Armed soldiers have been seen patrolling the airport runways, and jet fighters have been spotted flying over the area." "Jet fighters?"
Gerald sounded dumbstruck.
"What do you think this is about, Paul? A terrorist attack?"
"Maybe," Paul replied, "but perhaps it's something entirely different. Let's see if we can tell truth from lies. As it happens, we have in our studio tonight an eyewitness to a very strange event that had taken place just before the airport was closed. His name is Bill Carston, and he lives just outside Heathrow." "Hello, Bill," Gerald said. "Welcome to the show." "Thank you, Gerald," Bill responded. "Big fan of your show." "So, Bill, what is it you saw the other day?"
"Well," Bill started unhurriedly, "I live near the airport, just like Paul said. People think that living near an airport is a pain because of all the noise, but after a while you get so used to the sound of the plane engines, you stop noticing it. But what's really nice is that because of the airport, we don't have any tall buildings or big power lines around. It's all farmland, and on a clear day you can see for miles around." "And was it a clear day 3 days ago?" Paul tried to get his guest back on track. "It was beginning to rain again," Bill replied, "but not yet heavy rain, not like today. And it was early enough in the day so you could see far away." "So what did you see that morning?" Bill paused. "I don't even know what to call it. I'd never seen anything like that before. It was flying above the pastures and not in a straight upward line like planes do. It would go up and down like a helicopter." "Maybe it was a helicopter." "I don't think so. Helicopters
make a hell of a racket. And that thing was quiet, very quiet, and it didn't look like a helicopter or a plane. It was more like a giant kite."
"Well, then, perhaps it was a kite, or a glider plane."
"No,"
Bill was adamant.
"No glider plane could fly the way that thing did. One moment it was diving down, and another moment it was soaring up, like no gravity or winds could stop it."
"What an interesting observation," Paul commented. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" "What are you trying to say, Paul?" "I'll tell you, Gerald. But before I do, here is another interesting piece of information. Something else happened in the last 3 days, but for whatever reasons didn't make it into the newspaper. In the last 3 days, several farmers from the land surrounding the airport reported their sheep missing." "So what? Sheep go missing all the time." "Not off the fenced properties, they don't." "So what is it, then?" Paul's voice acquired a conspiratorial tone. "In the past, cattle disappearances have been often reported in and around the places of UFO sightings." Gerald paused. "Wait a minute, Paul. Are you saying that this thing Bill saw was an alien ship?" "I am not saying that, but you can see how one may come to such a conclusion. Something is going on at the airport, and I suspect that whatever it is, it goes well beyond your usual technical difficulties." As Gerald and Paul got in a quarrel over whether the giant kite Bill had seen could have been an alien spaceship, Scooter, who until that moment had been listening very carefully, turned off the radio. By then it was really late. Scooter wished Hoggie good night and departed to the bedroom. Hoggie stayed in the kitchen, rereading Edward Barnaby's letters and every other article and document from the life of Alexander Libri they had collected. She hoped to find some clue she had missed, something that would bring them closer to solving the mystery of the mirror. Hoggie did not believe that there was another room in the secret library they hadn't found yet. She was convinced that the notorious mirror, if it was hidden in the library, was among the books they had already seen. She made a list of all the books she could remember from their search, and went up and down the list several times, trying to figure out which of these books could be the most valuable one in the whole world. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Hoggie finally put her list away. She was tired and ready for bed, but just as she stretched on the kitchen bench with a roll-up coat under her head, she had an idea.
"The bookworm,"
Hoggie said, sitting up. It had occurred to her that the bookworm she and Scooter found in Oddities and Curiosities room had read thousands of books. What if it had seen the mirror as well? Hoggie tiptoed to her bedroom, where Scooter was snoring away, took the large biscuit tin in which she kept the bookworm, and then walked back to the kitchen. She then opened the tin, took out the worm, and placed it under the desk lamp. The bookworm was sleepy and displeased with this rude awakening.
"Have you ever seen the book called The Mirror?"
Hoggie asked.
"It is small, and has a worn brown cover with a silver clasp in the shape of a lion. It is a very old book."
For a while the bookworm was quiet. Hoggie even thought that it fell asleep again. But then, suddenly, it began to recite in its soft voice. Quickly Hoggie moved her ear closer to the worm, and began to jot down what it was saying.
"Today is March 8, 1910, the day I lost my best friend. Her name is Sophie, and she is the cleverest, kindest, and jolliest girl in the world. If I had her as my friend for the rest of my life, I'd never be bored or sad again. We did not quarrel. They simply took her away from me. They took her and her father and put them on a ship named the Rosamunda, like they were not even people, like they were things that had no voice, or feelings, or dreams. I stood on the pier, looking at Sophie over the heads of the policemen, those stupid, Stupid heads. She was not crying, even though I was. She stood there as strong as any of the grown men around her, smiling and waving at me. I wish I were as strong as she. I wish I were stronger. I wish I were so strong I could make the ocean tides flow backwards. I wish I could summon the winds and send them after the Rosamunda, and bring the ship back to London, and make her land right here in my parents' front yard. I feel sad. I have never felt sadder in my entire life."
The bookworm fell silent again, curled in a ball, and resumed its sleep. Hoggy was very excited at first, but already, as she was writing down the second sentence, she realized what it was that the bookworm had given her: the missing page from Alexander Libri's journal, the one that, for some reason, the future architect had never continued, the one that Hoggy had found in the secret library, and the one that some hoodlum had stolen from her school locker. It was interesting to learn what young Alexander felt upon losing his friend, but it wasn't at all what Hoggy was looking for.
"No,"
Hoggy said to the worm,
"this isn't it. Try again. The mirror. It is a very old and valuable book. You must have seen it."
But the bookworm ignored her, and so, with a sigh, she placed it back into the biscuit tin. Hoggy then read Alexander Libri's entry in the journal again. This time she noticed something she hadn't noticed before.
"That's quite a coincidence," she murmured. "One day, Alexander writes about how he wishes the winds brought the Rosamunda back, and 3 days later, Hurricane Eastender does bring the ship back."
As Hoggy thought about this strange coincidence a little longer, she remembered another coincidence, one that happened just recently. She wasn't sure that she remembered it right, and so she stuck her hand into Scooter's backpack and fished out the draft of the short story he had written for their English class. Half the story was scribbled on regular notebook paper, but the other half was written on a faded page from Alexander Libri's journal. Hoggy brought the page closer to her eyes, and read the first sentence.
"And so, one night, the bronze lion went for a stroll around London."
A feeling of unease stirred inside Hoggy. Ever since she saw the statue of the lion leaning against Saint Jerome's right thigh, she did not stop wondering how it could possibly have happened. Whoever was responsible for the change, they would need a crane, a new statue, and a whole team of workers to move it, an effort that simply couldn't go unnoticed. Yet, no one saw or heard anything. One evening the statue of the lion was standing by Saint Jerome's left side, and the following morning it was sitting by his right. It was as if the lion had moved of its own will. And here was Scooter, writing about the bronze lion walking around London. Writing it in Alexander Libri's journal, which made it 2 strange coincidences involving the journal. Hoggy got up and circled the kitchen. She had a tingling sensation that she was about to discover something very important. She wished she still had the journal. She took out the silver medallion that used to keep the pages of the journal shut, and studied it. Small and round, it bore the picture of Omega, a letter of the ancient Greek alphabet that was shaped as an arch. Or at least, that was what Scooter thought it was. Hoggy didn't know any Greek. Still, at the time she had a feeling that she had seen the picture somewhere. As she circled the kitchen again, her gaze fell upon the calendar on the wall. It was a cheap poster calendar, on which Hoggy marked the days when she was supposed to get paid for walking the dogs. Drawn in the centre of the poster was the zodiac, a sequence of 12 fantastic creatures, each corresponding to one of the 12 constellations, and 12 months of the year. Scorpio was shaped as a letter M, with a pointed tail, and represented November. A couple of short wavy lines were meant to look like water, and represented the constellation of Aquarius, and the month of February. There was among the 12 signs of the zodiac one that was called Leo. This sign represented the constellation of the lion, and it was shaped as the ancient Greek letter Omega.
"My goodness!"
Hoggie whispered. She sank down on the bench, and remained seated for several minutes, not believing the idea that had just occurred to her. But then again, why was this idea so unbelievable? Many of the things that Hoggie and Scooter had experienced in the last few weeks would sound unbelievable to Hoggie's ears if someone else told her about them. But she had seen those things with her own eyes.
"But how is it possible?"
Hoggie continued to wonder. She glanced at the list of books she had put together earlier. One of the book titles attracted her attention more than others. Not because this book was particularly odd, but because of the impression it made on Hoggie when she first read it. Suddenly, she had her answer. Just then, the desk lamp went out. Hoggie tried to turn on the ceiling light, but it wasn't working either. And neither was the refrigerator or the radio. The rain must have damaged the power lines. To her own surprise, Hoggie didn't at all feel frightened, or even bothered by this new disaster. For a while, she remained in the kitchen, calmly contemplating the amazing discovery she had made just seconds before the city plunged into darkness. Then, just as calmly, she rose and went to her room. Scooter was startled to find Hoggie standing by his bed, holding a flashlight.
"Oh, what time is it?"
he mumbled groggily.
"It's about 4 a.m.
Scooter rubbed his eyes.
"Did something else happen? And why are you holding the flashlight?" "The power is out,"
Hoggie explained.
"Scooter, I know why the kidnappers are after the mirror."
Suddenly, Scooter's sleepiness was gone.
"Tell me."
Hoggie sat down on the edge of the bed.
"Remember the story of Hurricane Eastender? The one that brought the Rosamunda back to London?"
Scooter nodded.
3 days before that happened, Alexander Libri made an entry in his journal. He wrote that he wished the winds and the ocean brought the ship back. How do you know that? The bookworm told me. He had read the journal.
Scooter said.
"That's quite a coincidence." "That's what I said. But then I remembered how he wrote a story of the bronze lion going for a walk around the city, and how a few days later someone or something left huge holes in the streets around the library and smashed a car, and how the statue of the lion turned up on the wrong side of Saint Jerome. And so I thought, what if it really happened?"
"What happened?"
"The bronze lion going for a midnight stroll."
Scooter frowned.
"That's crazy."
"As crazy as my bookworm? Or as crazy as your dodo?"
Scooter thought about it for a second.
"Go on."
"And then I thought of the remarkable trees of the world."
Scooter nodded.
"I remember that book."
"And do you remember the story of the wishing tree?"
"I thought it was just a legend."
"But what if it wasn't just a legend? What if such a tree really existed? What if it really could make people's wishes happen? And what if, before people destroyed the last of these wonderful trees, someone made a book out of its leaves? An amazing book that made everything that was written in it come true. Remember what Dr. Barnaby told us about the mirror? It is the most fascinating story you will have ever read, but you won't know what the book is about until you have found it. This is because before you read a story from the book, you have to write one."
Scooter was silent for a few moments as Hoggie's words sank in.
"This would certainly explain why someone would lie and murder to find the mirror," he realized. "With a book like that, you could be the most powerful person in the world."
"It would also explain why Libri and the Society of Saint Jerome went into so much trouble hiding the book,"
Hoggie remarked.
"They didn't want something so dangerous falling into the wrong hands."
If the room weren't so dark, Hoggie would see how pale Scooter turned suddenly.
"But if you're right, Hoggie, and Libri's journal is the mirror, then it did happen."
"What happened?"
"The book
falling into the bad guys' hands. Imagine the things they can do with it. I mean, they have already killed one person and kidnapped another."
Hoggy thought about it for a moment.
"I wouldn't necessarily start worrying just yet," she said. "Whoever stole the mirror, it wasn't Aunt Michelle's kidnappers, because if they had the book, they wouldn't need us to be looking for it, would they? Also, those thugs that broke into my locker, they didn't just take the mirror. They took my wallet and a lot of other things, which makes me think they probably weren't looking for anything in particular. They just grabbed whatever was there. Chances are," she concluded, "they still don't know what they have."
This was a comforting thought, and the friends would feel relieved if it weren't for one thing. They still didn't know who the burglars were, and where the mirror was. Hoggy reflected on this for a few moments. The quickly fading flashlight in her hand pointed at the floor by the bed, where a puddle of water was forming rapidly.
"Hey!"
Hoggy said.
"Why is there water on the floor?"
Hoggy thought at first that the refrigerator had melted, and the water had trickled all the way down the corridor. But then she noticed that the water was coming from under the window frame. She peeped through the dusty window pane and gasped,
"My goodness, Scooter! We're being flooded!"
Indeed, in the last few hours, the water level had risen by a good 1/2 metre. Already, the narrow alley between Hoggy's apartment building and the neighbouring house had turned into a small canal. The water was continuing to rise. A few more minutes, and it would spill into the apartment. Hoggy was so surprised by this discovery, for a few moments she forgot about the mirror, the book thieves, and even about her aunt's kidnapping.
"What is going on?"
she cried.
"The river must have overflown," Scooter guessed. "Last time it happened in 1928, London literally turned into an island. You couldn't get through Chelsea without a boat." "Come on," he then said. "Let's get out of here while we still can."
Hoggy did not have much to pack. She grabbed her coat, her parents' photograph, the biscuit tin containing the bookworm, and a couple of her favourite books. The friends ran out and down the corridor to the main entrance. Hoggy's and Aunt Michelle's apartment at the back of the building was dark and cold, but also very quiet. Sheltered in it from the rest of the world, the friends had not noticed how in the past few hours London had been brought into the state of utter chaos. Now that they once again found themselves outside, they were stunned by the sight of people, some still in their nightgowns, wading through the waist-high water, holding their suitcases and dogs and cats above their heads. The cars parked on both sides of the street all but disappeared out of sight. Helicopters were hovering above, shedding lights on the dark and flooded city. A handful of tenants from Hoggy's apartment building crowded at the top of the stairs, uncertain whether they should wait the flood out in their homes or leave before things got worse. Scooter recognized 2 of them, a spindly, grey-haired woman and a short, balding man, as Mr. and Mrs. Gullitch. In spite of her predicament and the general chaos around her, Mrs. Gullitch was calm. The only possessions she brought with her were a pack of cigarettes and her cat, Bassoon. She was smoking one of her cigarettes just then.
"How come you 2 puppies all by yourself?"
the old woman asked, noticing Hoggy and Scooter.
"Where is your aunt?"
"She's working," Hoggy lied. Mrs. Gullitch shook her head.
"Hell of a night to be trapped in the city."
"Has the Thames overflown?" Scooter asked.
"So they say,"
Mrs. Gullitch confirmed. "Is the whole city flooded?" The old woman shook her head.
"Primrose Hill is all right. Hempstead, too. They're both up on the hills. The question is, how does one get there?"
"We'll walk." Mr. Gullitch spoke suddenly. "So put out that cigarette, Edna, and come along."
"I'm not going anywhere." "Yes, you are,"
Mr. Gullitch insisted. "Come along, I tell you."
"And I'm telling you I'm not getting into this icy water. Not at my age."
"Well, I'm not staying here," her husband said.
"Fine." Mrs. Gullitch threw her cigarette into the water below. "You go, then."
"I will." Mr. Gullich marched to the bottom of the stairs, and with one last glance at his stubborn wife, walked into the water. "Ugh!" he said.
"Exactly,"
Mrs. Gullich uttered under her breath, while lighting another cigarette. "I am leaving now, Edna," Mr. Gullich announced, and as his wife did not reply, he made a few long strides down the street. Suddenly, he yelped and stopped short.
"What is it, Tom?"
Mrs. Gullich asked. Very slowly, Mr. Gullich turned around. "Someone just touched my knee."
"Oh, don't be silly, Tom."
"No, seriously." Scooter shed the light of his flashlight onto the street. There was Mr. Gullich, tiny and scared, standing up to his armpits in the dark water. Then, suddenly and just for a split second, a triangular fin popped out of the water a couple of steps away from him.
"Shark!"
Scooter yelled. The next moment, Mr. Gullich was scrambling up the stairs, while the rest of the neighbourhood's residents, who happened to be in the water, were wading and swimming speedily towards nearby porches, trees, and cars. The discovery of the shark was so unexpected, even Edna Gullich was surprised. The cigarette fell out of her mouth.
"Well, I'll be! Are you sure you didn't imagine it?"
Scooter's flashlight, along with the flashlights and kerosene and mosquito lamps of other tenants, illuminated the street below, and sure enough, moving unhurriedly back and forth across the street, was a shark, and another, and another. Mrs. Gullich said. "Isn't this the strangest thing?" Scooter and Hoggy just shrugged. Nothing surprised them any more. Mr. Gullich wiped the water off his face and announced, "I hope you're happy, Edna. Now we really are stuck in here." Mrs. Gullich patted her husband on the shoulder. "Let's go home, Tom. Things always seem 10 times worse in the dark. In the morning the city will send rescue teams to take us out of here. We'll be fine by then. Let's go home. We still have some beer left in the fridge, and it is not going to get any colder." The mention of the beer went a long way towards helping Mr. Gullich to recover from shock. Next moment he was climbing the stairs. As Mrs. Gullich, too, turned to leave, she said, "Why won't you kids come as well? I'll make sardine sandwiches, and we'll have a flood party."
"Thank you, Mrs. Gullich,"
Hoggy replied.
"I think we'll go up to the roof and take a look around."
From the roof of the apartment building, London looked even more of a mess. A few houses here and there were lit, but for the most part the city was completely dark. Hoggy sat down right on the wet roof, and thought about her own mess. Someone in the city below had in their possession a book that could, at any moment, bring about the worst disasters imaginable. Someone else in the same city wanted this very book so badly, they had kidnapped Aunt Michelle. Hoggy did not know who any of those people were. What's more, she was trapped in the house, and could neither go looking for the book, nor for her aunt. Suddenly, Hoggy thought of the dodo.
"Is General going to be all right?"
"Oh, yes," Scooter assured her.
"Did you hear what Mrs. Gullich said? Our neighbourhood was not flooded, and with all the lights out, maybe he'll finally go to sleep. I'm more worried about my dad," he added. "Why, he isn't even in London." "Exactly. He is still on the plane. They won't let him land at Heathrow. And with all the crazy news coming from London, he must be worried sick. I tried calling him, but the phone is dead too." Great, Hoggy thought. Now they were completely cut off from the rest of the world. It wasn't even comforting that the rain had finally stopped. Scooter sat down next to his friend. "She is right, you know," he said. "Who?"
"Mrs. Gullich. Things always seem 10 times worse in the dark." Hoggy sighed.
"I suspect that morning isn't going to look any better."
"It might." Scooter took off his coat and wrapped it around Hoggy. She placed her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes.
For a while she listened to the distant sounds of fire sirens and people shouting. Soon, however, the weariness swept over her, and she fell asleep.